The most bloody battles of World War II took place, of course, on the Eastern Front. Here, it should be clearly understood that the Nazis suffered losses not only at the front itself, but also in the rear. They were killed not only by soldiers, but also by partisans and local residents, sometimes even children. Therefore, soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht died quite often, not from bullets and shells, although indisputably there were enough terrible deaths at the front. At the front, although German medicine was quite successful in dealing with many wounds and injuries, many soldiers and officers died from gangrene, blood poisoning, and infections caused by dirt or foreign objects getting into wounds. Such deaths were quite severe and painful, with the wounded often dying over several days to a month, depending on the strength of their immunity. It is not a secret that many of the wounded, understanding what awaited them, asked medical workers to help them die. At the same time, many of the wounded did not even reach medical units. Hundreds and thousands died of blood loss during combat, such as when a limb was severed or a piece of shrapnel cut an artery. A rather terrible death, oddly enough, was a wound to the buttock. In the worst case, a bullet or shrapnel could hit an artery, and the unfortunate would die of blood loss without any way to stop it. During battles, shelling, or air raids, many soldiers were dismembered and died trying to stuff their insides back in. There were a huge number of such cases on both sides. A shot to the stomach was considered a terrible death, as the unfortunate often experienced terrible pain until the end. During hand-to-hand encounters, bayonets and saber blades were the most common weapons used by Red Army soldiers and officers. Many Nazis were killed this way. There were cases where opponents strangled each other, smashed their heads with stones, or even pushed earth into their mouths until they suffocated. Another terrible death was from fire, such as when tanks caught fire or flamethrowers were used. As a rule, it was not possible to escape from the fire. Death from the cold was also quite difficult, especially on the Eastern Front, where German forces were often not provided with a sufficient amount of warm clothing. The Germans simply froze in the trenches, especially when retreating or being surrounded. The most famous cases of mass death from the cold are the Winter Offensive and retreat near Moscow in 1941 and the Battle of Stalingrad. Exhausted by continuous fighting, soldiers often simply laid down in the snow to rest and never got up again. The largest number of terrible deaths happened during urban battles. The wounded could fall out of windows and break to death, or a soldier could die under the rubble of a house. Finally, crossing water barriers was also a common and terrible way to die, especially for those who did not know how to swim. If a shell hit a raft or boat, they were likely to sink like a stone and had no chance of surviving due to the weight of weapons and ammunition. During the battle for the Caucasus, many Nazis died falling into abysses or being buried under avalanches. Pilots operating at sea often died of cold after jumping out of wrecked planes. If help did not arrive on time, they usually died within a few hours. Of course, one cannot fail to mention those moments when soldiers, especially the wounded, fell under the tracks of tanks. Tankers, through their viewing ports, could not even see what was under the tracks. In the rear, it must be understood that since the attack on the Soviet Union, Hitler's Germany carried out a real genocide of the local population and prisoners of war. A huge number of concentration camps, mass executions, and the burning of entire villages led to the local population joining the partisans. The partisans did not stand on ceremony towards the Nazis. The best a German could expect was death from a bullet, a knife, or a mine explosion. Given that at first partisans did not have enough weapons, they often used improvised means, sending the Germans to the other world in rather cruel ways. For example, Nazis were strangled with ropes or strings, and the decapitation method was widely used when a guitar wire was pulled between two trees at the level of a motorcycle's neck. When a German motorcycle was driving, the driver's head was often cut off by the string. Partisans and sabotage groups also tried to destroy garrisons by setting fire to barracks and command offices, causing everyone inside to suffocate in the smoke or burn alive. Partisans often used self-made mines stuffed with pieces of glass, iron, and even small stones. Doctors were often unable to completely remove the foreign objects from the wounded, leading to deaths from inflammation and sepsis. It is impossible not to mention the terrible deaths of those who either returned to the front in trains or were being transported to Germany. One of the main guerrilla sabotages was the undermining of railway tracks, causing locomotives to go downhill and pull all the cars along with them. Naturally, the partisans did not inspect the cars in detail, so those who survived often had to deal with wild animals. Of course, one cannot overlook the fate of the prisoners. Partisans generally did not stand on ceremony, as watching prisoners was an unnecessary burden, so they were simply shot. However, there were cases of quite painful executions, especially concerning collaborators who fought on the side of the Wehrmacht. At best, they received a bullet in the forehead, but there were cases where partisans forced collaborators to decide for themselves who would survive and be taken prisoner. All detainees were given sticks or locks and began to kill each other. Prisoners could also be driven into swamps and drowned. Finally, there were so-called wild guerrilla units, which fought as they wished and treated prisoners according to their level of hatred. There were cases where, in winter, a captured Nazi was poured with water until he turned into an ice sculpture. Such sculptures were placed at night at German garrisons, often with a sign on their chest. This topic is not sufficiently covered and known, but it is a fact that many civilians, witnessing the atrocities of the Nazis, turned into lone avengers. Fragmentary information is known about the Children's Detachment of Little Witches, where children aged 10 to 14, armed with shovels, scythes, and other agricultural tools, attacked lone Nazis and beat them to death. In the area of the village of Ram in Turovka, the only surviving resident became an avenger after all the others were burned in a barn by the Nazis. He dug spikes into the road with the points up and waited for cars. When a car ran into the spikes, the wheels would burst, and at this time, the resident quietly attacked a German or a group of Germans and strangled them with a guitar string. It is impossible to establish the total number of such lone avengers, but according to some reports, the Nazis even ended up in hospitals after being hit in the stomach with a pitchfork or struck from behind with an axe. Many died from the effects of poisoning. Local residents who worked in canteens often sprinkled food with poison. By 1943, for example, in occupied Belarus, the Nazis did not move alone and generally tried not to appear near the forest. They also avoided going out into the streets, especially in villages at night. There were cases where Germans who did come out were found several days later, drowned in a well, or simply disappeared forever. It must be said that the death described below was true for both sides, from the Soviet Union and the Nazis. The number of victims has not been officially announced to this day. This death is madness. At the time of artillery shelling, bombing, or non-stop fighting, the psyche of many soldiers simply could not withstand the stress, and they went crazy. Both Soviet and German soldiers and officers often recalled that after a massive bombardment, the survivors did not pose any threat. Some moved like sleepwalkers, not reacting to anything. The treatment of such wounded was frankly a matter of chance. Many of them died after a few days or a month without leaving a state of frustration. Many, under the influence of certain memories, jumped out of the windows of hospitals and died, cut their veins, or tried to kill themselves with any sharp objects. The horror of this state was that often young and healthy people who were alive were actually dead.